All right, everybody, welcome to lab exercise 25, where today we're going to start talking about the anatomy of the urinary system. This week we'll be talking about urinary anatomy, and then next week we will talk about urinary physiology. So let's go ahead and get started. The urinary system is composed of the kidneys and the urinary tract. And when I say urinary tract, I am referring to the ureters, which you see here in yellow, the bladder, urinary bladder, and the urethra. So altogether then, our urinary system are the kidneys. Sorry about that. We have the kidneys and ureter, urinary bladder, and urethra. One thing to note is that our kidneys are considered retroperitoneal. And what that means is that they're actually sitting behind the abdominal cavity. And so if we look at this picture over here to the far left, you'll see that everything in this blue encasing is considered the peritoneal cavity. And you'll notice that the kidneys are not actually encased within that blue cavity. They're actually located behind. So it's something interesting about the kidneys as an organ is that, instead of being within this peritoneal cavity, like most of our abdominal organs, they're actually located retroperitoneal, meaning behind the peritoneal cavity. So what do the kidneys do then? They have a lot of really important functions, including filtering our metabolic wastes. They also help to regulate body fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance through secretion, reabsorption, and excretion of molecules such as water, electrolytes, bicarbonate, and hydrogen ions. Additionally, they help the liver detoxify certain compounds, and finally synthesize glucose during times of starvation. Now, one thing that you may not know about the kidneys is that they actually produce what's called EPO, or erythropoietin. And erythropoietin is what actually regulates the formation of red blood cells. So our kidneys are vital in making red blood cells for our bodies. So, and now we're going to move on and talk about the anatomy of the kidney. So we'll start by talking about the fact that the kidneys themselves are encased with 3 layers of connective tissue. And that is going to include renal fascia, which is going to be sort of outlaying on this dark red that you see here. Additionally, we're going to have an adipose capsule. And then finally, we're going to have the renal capsule. And the renal capsule is highlighted here in this white color. So sort of this white line that I'm drawing over top of right now. And basically that just holds the kidney together. The hilum is going to be the area where the blood vessels in the ureter is going to enter the kidney. And so on our picture over here, the hilum includes this section, okay, where all of these things are entering into the kidney. Okay, so this is the hilum. Okay. Moving on from there, we have the cortex, the renal cortex. And the cortex is going to be this superficial region. So kind of drawing over it here, this superficial region of the kidney. So it is the region that contains blood vessels that are going to supply our nephrons, which we will talk about shortly. Next is the medulla, the renal medulla. And the renal medulla is basically everything that is in this section that I'm sort of circling here. Okay, all of this is all renal medulla. And so the renal medulla then is going to have some different structures within it that I would like to point out. So first are the renal pyramids. And the renal pyramids are then these structures that literally look like pyramids. So let me just shade one whole pyramid in for you. Okay. So here is a renal pyramid, and you can see them all along this drawing. Each pyramid is going to contain looping tubules of nephrons. And so what is separating these renal pyramids then are what we call renal columns. Okay, so our renal columns are the structures here that are separating the renal pyramids. Okay, so here would be a column, here's a column, here's a column, and so on. Okay, so all of those are the columns. Finally, the papilla, and I'm just going to clear these drawings. The renal papilla are basically just the tips of the pyramids, and so you can see they have sort of a different color here. They're in more of this dark brown color on this image. It's a light brown color. But essentially, what's going to happen is that fluid made by the kidneys is going to start out sort of up here in this area, and then the fluid is going to drain down this way until it reaches these tips, these little renal papilla. Then it's going to drain into these spaces between the columns right after the tips. And those little spaces are called the minor calyces. So let me just try and sort of put my stylus in here. All of these are considered minor calyces. Okay, so they're just after the tips of the pyramids. So going back to our discussion, after fluid drains into these minor calyces, many minor calyces are going to come together, which is what you can see happening here. You have a minor calyx. We're going to say we have 4 of them coming together and forming this space called a major calyx. Okay. So after our fluid drains from our minor calyces, it's going to drain into the major calyx, and then it's going to flow down this way into the renal pelvis, which the renal pelvis is just basically the entire area that includes the minor and major calyces, but basically all the fluid is flowing into this renal pelvis, where then it will flow into the ureter. Okay, so this is just some basic anatomy, sort of more macroscopically speaking, of the kidney. Now let's talk about blood flow through the kidney. And to do this, I'm going to try and trace this for you guys in color. so that you can sort of get an understanding of where we're going here. Okay, so we're going to start out here in the renal artery. Okay, and so the renal artery is going to deliver about 1,200 milliliters of blood per minute to the kidney to be filtered. All right, so all the fluid that I was talking about in the last slide is fluid that's coming out of the blood and being put into the kidney, then into the ureter, then into the bladder, and then excreted from our bodies via urine. So essentially where we are making urine from is blood is going to come into the kidney through the renal artery. Okay, so we have blood coming in. And then what's going to happen is this renal artery is going to branch. And the first branch here and this branch, first time it branches, these are called segmental arteries. Okay. And then what's going to happen is that these segmental arteries are going to branch again. We see there's a branch. Let me just do it in another color so we can kind of keep this thing going. So we're going to have the branches of the segmental arteries here, 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 and each of these are called an interlobar artery. Okay, so interlobar artery. So I'm just going to try to highlight these in these colors here so we can know which one's which. There's our segmental, and then we had our renal artery in green. Okay, so each of these interlobar arteries then are going to come around. So for all intents and purposes, because the image has this section sort of zoomed in, I'm going to go through this just like it would be up here. Just note that these vessels are actually passing underneath of this renal pelvis, and that's where it's branching. Okay, so going back here, then this segmental artery would branch into this way and this one and this one. Okay, here, here, and here. All right, and once those interlobar arteries reach this outer cortex area, they are going to basically turn around and they're going to go that way. It's really not the greatest color. Let me pick another color so we can see that a little better. Okay, they're going to go that way. All right, and then this interlobar artery would go this way. This interlobar artery would go those ways. All right, so we see how that one's branching. And these branchings, the white branchings that I just drew, are the arcuate arteries. Okay, so I'm going to draw that up here on this top picture now, right? Arcuate arteries. Then what's going to happen is the arcuate arteries are going to give off a branch, a small interlobar artery. And that small interlobar artery is giving off a branch called the afferent arteriole. Okay, afferent arteriole. And then we reach this structure called the glomerulus. And in the glomerulus, which is what you see right here, The glomerulus is the point at which blood is going to be filtered out of the vessel and put into this yellow structure, which is called a nephron. Okay, so once we've done that, once we've put the things that we want into the nephron, whatever's left in the blood is going to leave the glomerulus via this efferent arteriole, and it's going to enter this network of peritubular capillaries. Okay, so that's sort of all of this that you're seeing wrapped around the nephron. Okay. From the peritubular capillaries, the vessel, all these peritubular capillaries are going to come back together, and they are going to begin to work their way back out the kidney. All right, and so that's going to first happen through this interlobar vein. Okay, and then that interlobar vein is going to flow into the arcuate vein. All right, so if we are looking down here now, so we have this arcuate vein. Now we can bring our arcuate vein back out here. So we're going to say, here's our arcuate vein. Now remember, blood is now flowing in the opposite direction because we're exiting the kidney. So from the arcuate vein, then, all the arcuate veins are going to lead into an interlobar vein. The interlobar veins are all going to lead into the renal vein, where they will then exit, where the blood inside will then exit the kidney. Okay, so this is just the way that blood is going to flow through the kidney. So now that we understand blood flow, I'm going to talk about some more microscopic kidney structures. And those microscopic structures, I've already mentioned them once, but they are called nephrons. Okay, so the nephron is the structural and the functional unit of the kidney, and each kidney has millions of these nephrons. And we actually divide nephrons into two different parts. We have the corpuscle and the tubule part. Okay, and so this is very similar to the picture that you just saw when we were going through the blood flow through the kidney. So remember, we got up here and we gave off the afferent arteriole to the glomerulus, and this is the point at which I told you that some stuff was going to be filtered out of the blood and put into this yellow structure called the nephron. The nephron is going to be the functional unit here of the kidney, meaning it's going to be the sort of beginning of the synthesis of urine. Okay. The renal corpuscle is going to include this sort of circular area here. Okay, so the glomerulus, and then what we call the renal capsule, the glomerular capsule, excuse me. It's also called Bowman's capsule. You'll see it written in the literature sometimes as Bowman's capsule. So essentially then the corpuscle is everything here. Okay, and then the tubule is literally every other yellow thing that you see on this picture. Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's start with the corpuscle. So the corpuscle itself then would include that glomerulus and the glomerular capsule, also called Bowman's capsule. So this one's sometimes called So the glomerulus itself is this ball of looping fenestrated capillaries. Okay, so remember back to when we were talking about vessels, you have arteries, which give way to capillaries. And the capillaries is where gas exchange is happening. And then those capillaries give way back to veins. And if you remember, this is how blood was flowing through the vessels. Okay, and so the glomerulus then is the capillary between renal artery and renal vein, essentially, as a whole, as its entirety, we'll say. Now, in addition to the glomerulus, the renal corpuscle also includes Bowman's capsule, which I already mentioned is this layer, this yellow layer here. Now, I just want to point out that the afferent and the efferent arteriole, which lead to the glomerulus, this is all blood vessel. Even though it looks yellow, this is blood vessel. Okay, it looks yellow because it's the vessel is wrapped by these specialized cells. All right, and these cells are called podocytes. So whenever we're talking about Bowman's capsule, it contains two layers. The outer layer, which is sort of forming that C shape, okay? And then it has this inner layer, or the visceral layer, which are these podocytes here, okay? So it's two layers of tissue. The endothelial cells and the podocytes are going to form what is called this filtration membrane, okay? So picture it like this. You have blood coming in. You have blood coming in via the afferent arteriole, and then that blood is going to go along these loops, right? So it's going to go this way for that loop. And this one's going to take sort of this outer route maybe, and then maybe this one's going to go through this route and then this route. Okay, so we can see then the routes that blood would take through this glomerulus, okay? So it's this ball of capillaries. So blood is kind of going loop-de-loop all throughout these capillaries. Well, what happens is in this area, the blood, because the way that these podocytes are wrapped around it, the blood has the ability to be filtered out from inside of the capillary. So we're representing this part as being the capillary. And then this yellow part down here at the bottom, this part down here, this is sort of inside of this capsular space, okay? And by capsular space, I am referring to, let me just white it in here, all of this space here, that's sort of just outside of these loops, right? So this is all capsular space back here, okay? All right, so basically what happens then is that blood is going to be filtered out of these loops into this capsular space, okay? And it's not necessarily blood being filtered out, so I really should clarify that. The presence of these podocytes forms what's called a filtration membrane. And essentially, this filtration membrane, the whole purpose of having it is so that we keep some stuff inside of the capillary, and then we move other stuff out of the capillary into this capsular space that I have here in white. So things that we want to keep in, things like red blood cells. We probably don't want to lose those into the capsular space, because remember, if something goes into the capsular space, that means that it's going to go through the nephron and be destined to be urine and then be peed out, essentially. So we want to keep a lot of stuff in, because if we filter it out, then we're going to lose that stuff in urine. So red blood cells, excellent example. So essentially, as you can see by the formation of this filtration membrane, red blood cells are pretty big, and they are not going to be able to fit into these little tiny slots. And then into these little tiny slots, they don't have enough room to escape the capillary and enter the capsular space. This is a great thing for us. So the filtration membrane then is, in a sense, preventing really large substances from exiting the blood and going into the kidneys. However, things like water and small solutes like salt, this is stuff that we have to get rid of from time to time in order to maintain our fluid electrolyte acid base balance. So that's stuff that's kind of small that we want to be able to get rid of, and because we have this filtration membrane, we have the ability to do that at a very tightly regulated sort of way here. One thing I want to point out is that whenever somebody has a kidney injury, or whenever a kidney injury is suspected, one of the primary tests that we do straight up right away is do a urinalysis. And a urinalysis, if you're suspecting kidney injury, you can look for things like blood cells and proteins, which normally aren't supposed to be in the urine. And if they are in the urine, that might indicate that there could be kidney damage. Okay, so it's a very good tool to be able to understand this stuff, because you can sort of apply it to a clinical scenario. Okay, so parts of the nephron. Now that we've talked about the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule, we're going to go through and talk about the different parts of the nephron. And so the first part that we will discuss is the proximal convoluted tubule. So just after we leave Bowman's space, we enter this section. Okay, and this is proximal convoluted tubule. And then from here, we're going to go into what's called the loop of Henle, also sometimes called the nephron loop. But we have two limbs. So first, we're going to go down, which is called the descending limb. And then we're going to go back up via the ascending limb. Okay, so just so we are kind of on the same page, just know that the fluid is flowing this direction. Okay, so first the fluid flows down, and then it's flowing back up. And the next segment of the nephron that we reach is the distal convoluted tubule. And the distal convoluted tubule, called convoluted because it's sort of twisty, is there. And then finally, after our fluid inside of these nephrons, so remember, because fluid flowed out of the glomerulus into this space, it's now taking this route until eventually we can make it leave the body through urination. So after we leave the distal convoluted tubule, then we're going to go into this thing called the collecting duct. And I'm just going to quickly point out that the collecting duct one structure, but it has two names based on which section of the kidney that we're talking about, right? So if this essentially would be a pyramid down here. Okay, and out in this sort of top section, this is all cortex, right? So remember, cortex is that outer part of the kidney, and then medulla was everything inside of that section. So medulla was like all of this stuff in here. Okay, so when talking about this collecting duct, the part of the collecting duct that is in the cortex is called the cortical collecting duct. And the part that is sitting down in the medulla is called the medullary collecting duct. Even though it's one thing, just know that it has two different names based on where it's located. So it starts out up in the cortical collecting duct, and then eventually, once it passes this sort of crosshair, this sort of barrier, not necessarily a barrier, but a change in tissue, it becomes the medullary collecting duct. And from here, then the medullary collecting duct will lead to the papilla, right? So it's going to lead to the tip of the pyramid down here, into the minor calyces, into the major calyces, into the ureter, into the bladder, into the urethra, and out the body. Okay, so these are just the structures of the nephron that you will be responsible for knowing on your quiz. All right, so I'm just going to go back for 1 second and talk about this thing called the JGA, or the juxtaglomerular apparatus. So this sort of goes more so with the renal corpuscle, as we were talking about the glomerulus itself. But it also kind of goes with the tubule, because it's this complex that's sitting sort of in between our corpuscle and our tubules. It's called this juxtaglomerular apparatus. And I say that because juxta means beside, glomerular would mean glomerulus, and apparatus. So it's the structure beside the glomerulus. And for all intents and purposes, it is this thing right here. Okay? Okay, so let's talk about it. The whole purpose of the juxtaglomerular apparatus is that it controls the flow of filtrate through the nephron, excuse me, and then it also controls the blood pressure within the glomerulus. So it has some cells, as we can see. It has some cells over here. It has some cells here. Okay, so some cells here, some cells are sort of lining these blood vessels. These cells can help us control the flow rate of the filtrate that's going through the nephron. So I've been referring to it previously as urine, but it's technically not urine until it leaves the kidney. So when that fluid is in the nephron, it's called filtrate. So these cells can help control the rate that filtrate is moving through the inside of these nephrons. And then these cells that are lining our vessels of the afferent and efferent arteriole can control blood pressure. So if you kind of think about what can happen is I told you guys back when we were learning about blood vessels that only one red blood cell can fit through a capillary at a time. And that's sort of what you see happening here. Only one red blood cell at a time is flowing through the capillary. If our blood pressure is high, say we have hypertension and we have really, really high blood pressure, for example, we can partially help our kidneys out because high blood pressure is not good for this filtration membrane. High blood pressure would mean that these blood vessels are really pushing against the walls of our, not only our vessels, but also our capillaries, and that could lead to fluid leaking and being put into the urine that we don't want to. But one of the ways that we can kind of help control this is that these JGA cells, the juxtaglomerular cells, once they sense that the pressure is too high, they can actually cause the blood vessel to vasoconstrict, right? So it can actually cause the blood vessel to get smaller, all right? And this is a good thing, right? Because now blood cells aren't going to be flowing quite as quickly through here. And that gives the capillaries time to do their job and filter things properly. All right. On the other note, I told you guys that we had these other cells here, and these ones over here, they're called the macula densa cells. The macula densa cells, they're located between the loop of Henle and the distal convoluted tubule. So let me just do this really quick. So we have this proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct. All right. And here is our glomerulus up in here. Afferent arteriole, efferent arteriole. Okay, so these macula densa cells, they're kind of located in this section, sort of sitting right here. All right, and essentially these macula densa cells, they also come in contact with part of the afferent arteriole. Okay, so let me undo this real quick. All right, so say these are our macula densa cells. They are sitting, again, in between loop of Henle and distal convoluted tubule. They're also touching part of the afferent arteriole. And essentially the macula densa cells, these are salt sensors. Macula densa, they are salt sensors. So remember I said that one of the functions of the kidney is to regulate our fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. And one of the ways that it does that is by sensing how much salt we have inside of our filtrate. And if it's, I don't know, say super salty, then we can preserve water that way. Okay, so just know for the purpose of the test for this week, the macula densa cells are salt sensors, and we'll talk more about the physiology of how all this stuff is working next week. All right, so sort of the last component here that I'm going to talk to you guys about is the second half of the urinary system. So we remember at the beginning of the lecture, I said that the urinary system includes the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. And so we covered the kidneys, and now let's talk about this urinary tract, the ureters, bladder, and urethra. So the ureters basically just deliver blood. Well, I'm sorry, they deliver urine, deliver urine from the kidneys to the bladder. All right, and the bladder is the organ that's going to store urine, and it's actually going to open up into the urethra. A couple of things to note about the bladder is that it's actually composed of muscle. So we see all of sort of this layer here. This is the detrusor muscle. And this is important because whenever we urinate, the muscle itself is actually what's contracting. And so if you can imagine this muscle contracting, that's essentially what it's going to do is just make the bladder smaller, sort of like squeeze it like you're squeezing a stress ball. All right. The rugae are these sort of divots and loops and swirls that you sort of see that it's not a perfectly smooth surface on the inside. And what these rugae do is that they allow the bladder to expand whenever it's filled with urine. Okay, so it gives us kind of like a extra pouch on your suitcase that you can unzip to, maybe allow your suitcase to expand just a little bit more so you can fit your extra 2 shirts in there. That's in a sense what the rugae are. Okay, so they're like little expansers that allow our bladder to expand a little bit more when it's filled with urine. And then finally, this final portion, final structure on the bladder is called the trigone. And it is the smooth triangular shaped inferior portion of the bladder. So it's here, here, here. Okay. I just want to point out that even though it looks like it on this picture, the ureters, they actually enter here, sort of at the bottom of the bladder. Okay, so they don't come in the top. They actually travel sort of behind all the way to the bottom, and that's where urine is going to be dumped into. Okay, and so each of these ureteral orifices, which are those little holes that you can see, that's where the ureter is actually entering the bladder. So that makes up one point of the trigone. There's one point of the trigone. Here's the second point of the trigone. And then the third point of the trigone is sort of at the entrance to the urethra. And it's called the trigone because when you put those 3 points together, it looks like a triangle. Okay. So the last structure here then is the urethra. And we have 2 structures on the urethra that I'd like to talk about. The first is the internal urethral sphincter. Okay, and so the internal urethral sphincter is sort of that muscle layer that I just highlighted. Sorry about that. The internal sphincter, I'm going to make that a little bit smaller, is composed of smooth muscle. And if you guys remember, smooth muscle is involuntary. So if urine wants to exit, say this internal sphincter is sort of stimulated and it relaxes and urine can start to flow outwards. But say you're not at a place that you can use the bathroom. That's where, thankfully, our external urethral sphincter comes into play, which is composed of skeletal muscle. So we see it here and here. And say that, you don't have a bathroom nearby and you have to hold it, then that external urethral sphincter can contract, and there we create a blockage, okay? When the external urethral sphincter and what's called our pelvic diaphragm, when they relax, so if we are in a place that we can use the bathroom, then our external urethral sphincter is relaxed, our internal urethral sphincter is relaxed, and then urine is expelled through this external urethral orifice. Okay, so basically the opening, the visible opening on the external portion of the body. And this process of expelling urine is actually called micturition. So micturition is just the fancy way of saying peeing. All right. So one last thing that I want to point out on this slide is having to do with the urethra. Okay. And specifically, I'm going to talk to you quickly about just some general difference between the male versus the female urethra, because they are vastly different. So here we have the male and the female. Here is the male's bladder and the male urethra, female bladder and female urethra. So right off the bat, you'll probably notice, and I'll just do it in this color because that'll be fun. All right, so male urethra. Was that. And then female urethra, I'll highlight. Okay, so right off the bat, what you probably notice is that the male urethra is incredibly longer than the female urethra. And that's absolutely true. The male urethra, on average, is about 20 centimeters long, whereas the female urethra is only about 4 centimeters long. Other thing I want to point out is that in the male, we have the male bladder. So I'm going to highlight male bladder is actually sitting anterior only to the rectum, whereas in females, we have the bladder, and then we have this thing called the uterus, and then we have the rectum. Okay, and so the female urinary bladder sits anterior to both the vagina, but also inferior to the uterus. So what's interesting about this anatomy is that if you think about what would be a consequence of this, during pregnancy, when there is a fetus growing in the uterus, as the uterus gets bigger and bigger because the baby is growing, you can imagine that the pressure, because of the weight of the baby here, is pushing directly down onto the urinary bladder. And so this is actually, because of the position of this is one of the reasons why pregnant women have to urinate so frequently, because this enlarged uterus is literally sitting directly on top of the bladder. Okay, so that's just some information I just wanted to point out on the slide. I don't have it written down, but I just wanted to point it out because it's very important to kind of think about the difference amongst the males and the females when it comes to the urinary tract. So at this point, I am finished with the lecture, and you can go ahead and work on your assignment and submit your quiz. As always, contact me if you have any questions, and have a good week.